Welcome to Voices of Life. And today we explore one of the most debated questions in religious history. How did the Qur'an emerge? Where did Islam come from? And how does its historical foundation compare with the Bible and the Christian faith that shaped nations long before the rise of Islam? This is a journey into manuscripts, history, and the claims that shaped two world religions. To begin this episode today is your host, Pastor David.
Welcome to Voices of Life, a ministry of the Church for Life. I'm Pastor David, and today we're asking a question that cuts to the heart of faith itself. Every religion claims divine origin. Every prophet says God spoke. But when we pull back the curtain and look at the historical record, what actually survives the light of day? Today's special compares two Abrahamic faiths, Christianity and Islam. Both claim the same God, both trace lineage to Abraham. But separated by roughly 600 years, they ask us to make very different historical leaps. Our question isn't which religion is true. That's for you and your conscience to decide. Our question is simpler. When we examine a timeline of evidence, which foundation has stood closer to its source? Let's begin in the beginning. 3,000 years ago, somewhere in the Bronze Age, the story starts. Judaism doesn't emerge from nothing. It builds on earlier civilization, but introduces something revolutionary. One God, not many gods fighting for power. One creator. Law, covenant. Archaeological evidence confirms Jewish presence in the land. The Ketef Hinnom silver scrolls dated approximately 630 BCE carry the precisely blessing from Numbers. Words recited today just as they were written nearly 3,000 years ago. The Dead Sea Scrolls preserved in caves from the 3rd century BCE through the 1st century CE contain large portions of the Hebrew Bible. When scholars compare them to later medieval manuscripts, the text remains remarkably consistent. This matters because we have physical artifacts from centuries before Christ. We have continuous tradition passing down the same text. We have multiple independent sources confirming the same narrative. Now fast forward 700 years, a carpenter's son walks the road of Galilee. Jesus of Nazareth doesn't start a new religion. He claims to fulfill the old one. Do not think I've come to abolish the law, he says. I've come to fulfill it. His ministry lasts maybe 3 years. Then comes to the crucifixion around 30 to 33 CE. And his followers claim something impossible. He rose from the dead. Here's where the timeline becomes critical. Within 25 years of Jesus' death, the Apostle Paul writes his first letters. These aren't stories passed through generations. These aren't legends developing over centuries. Paul's letters, Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, were written in the 50s and 60s CE. Some contain even older creedal formulas Christian had been reciting within 5 to 10 years of the resurrection claim itself. Think about the gap. Jesus dies 30 CE. Paul's letters begin 50 CE. Earliest creeds embedded in those letters, possibly 35 to 40 CE. That's eyewitness territory. People were still alive who saw the empty tomb, who walked with the risen Jesus, who could say, I touched him, I ate with him. The gospel narrative follow Mark around 70 CE, Matthew and Luke around 80 to 90 CE, and John around 90 to 100 CE, still within living memories of the apostles. And physical evidence, Papyrus P52, a fragment of John's Gospel, dates to approximately 125 CE, less than 100 years after the original events. In ancient history, that's lightning fast documentation. Most figures from antiquity don't get contemporary manuscripts. Alexander the Great, earliest surviving manuscripts come from 900 years after he lived. Jesus gets a different standard because his followers claimed something extraordinary, and extraordinary claims demand evidence. Now let's look at Islam's emergence. Now jump ahead 600 years. The year is 610 CE. Muhammad, age 40, receives what he says is the first Quranic revelation from the angel Gabriel. This continues over 23 years. Mecca, then Medina, until Muhammad's death in 632 CE. Let me be clear about what historians accept. Muhammad existed. There's absolute historical consensus there, no question. Revelations began around 610 CE. Traditional dating supported by early sources. Quranic manuscripts exist from the 7th century. Birmingham manuscript dated 568 to 645 CE. But here's what manuscripts cannot tell us. 1. Whether Gabriel actually spoke to Muhammad. 2. Whether the revelations came from God or created in his human mind. And 3. Whether Muhammad was a prophet or a political leader. Think about someone named Muhammad today coming up and saying he had a revelation and God has spoke to him. Today's world, I think we'd have a very different perspective. But the Birmingham Quran manuscript, yes, it's real. Its radiocarbon dating places back to 568 and 645 CE with 95.4 probability. That's significant. It means the text existed within Muhammad's lifetime or very shortly thereafter. But manuscripts prove existence, not divine origin. A handwritten letter from Napoleon proves Napoleon wrote it. It does not prove Napoleon's strategic genius was inspired by heaven. The Corpus Coranicum project at the Berlin Brandenburg Academy explicitly studies the Quran within late antique religion and literary environment. In plain language, the Quran emerged surrounded by Jewish and Christian texts, ideas and traditions already circulating for centuries. Scholars acknowledge substantial overlap. Stories of Abraham, Moses, Noah, and Jesus, moral teachings resembling biblical ethics, concepts of judgment, heaven, hell, familiar to Judeo-Christian audiences. The Metropolitan Museum of Art notes the Quran shares substantial material with Judeo-Christian traditions. This raises an unavoidable question. If Islam is generally completing what came before, why does the completion arrive 6 centuries later? Christianity begins with a person whose death and alleged resurrection were proclaimed immediately by eyewitnesses. Islam's begins with revelations delivered to one man, recorded after his death, standardized under Caliph Uthman around 650 CE, less than 25 years after Muhammad's death, but still, no eyewitnesses claim to supernatural events during Muhammad's lifetime, equivalent to a resurrection appearances. Muhammad's miracle is the text itself. Its eloquence, its prophecy claims, its scientific assertions, but text alone cannot verify divine authorship. Millions of literary works claim divine inspiration. None have been empirically confirmed. So we have to think about the evidence gap. Let me pause here and address the obvious objection. Isn't Christianity the same? Can't you prove the resurrection either? Well, it's an excellent question. And here's the difference. Christianity, Islam. Claims focus on historical events. Jesus born, preached, died, resurrection. For Islam, claims focus on textual revelation. Qur'an delivered, perfect, uncreated. Witnesses available within decades of the event for Jesus. No witnesses to the revelation, only Muhammad's testimony for Islam. For Jesus, non-Christian historians mention Jesus within 100 years. These were non-Christians. For Islam, external Muslim, non-Muslim records from 7th century are sparse. It's hardly any. Manuscripts appear within 100 years for Jesus. Manuscripts appear within Muhammad's lifetime, but reveal nothing about authenticity. For Jesus, transformation of disciples documented martyrdom for belief. For Islam, Muhammad's transformation documented merchant to leader, but motive is debated. The Christian claim is falsifiable in principle. Find the body, and the claim collapses. For investigate eyewitness testimony, cross-examine. The Islamic claim is unfalsifiable as well. Private revelation, unverifiable. Subjective literary judgment. Neither can be proven in a laboratory, but Christianity at least proposes testable claims about history. Islam proposes faith claims about divine communication. Now, consider the question of credibility standards in a secular society. The U.S. courts evaluate religious groups for tax exemption, legal recognition, and accommodation requests. The standard isn't, is the religion true? Does this group demonstrate sincere belief and doctrinal coherence? When courts deny religious status, it's not theological judgment, it's about commercial fraud, political organizations disguised as worship, or groups lacking sustained community structure. But notice what courts don't do. They don't validate one revelation over another. They can't. The First Amendment prevents government from declaring which faiths speak truth. However, courts can examine whether new religious movements meet minimum thresholds for legal protection. Scientology eventually gained tax-exempt status in the 1990s after decades of litigation. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints faced persecution initially, but earned constitutional recognition over time. Why does this matter for our comparison? Because if someone invented a religion called Galaxians tomorrow with a new holy book, a prophet, a new commandment, 10 commandments or whatever, what would distinguish it from Islam in its earliest days? So think about it this way. If I wrote a holy book today called the Galaxians Gospel, I dated it 2026, and I distributed copies worldwide, 1,000 years from now, archaeologists could carbon date the parchment, or in this case, maybe electronic record, but they could find my name in copyright records. They could track every digitized backup on servers that survived. They would know exactly when I wrote it. Would that make my revelations from outer space any more credible than Muhammad's from heaven? Would the precision of modern dating make Galaxians divinely inspired? No, because the question wasn't when the book was written. It was the revelation real? That's still unprovable. The only difference is that Islam emerged when verification methods were weaker, and Christianity emerged when eyewitness testimony still mattered. Nothing, absolutely nothing except time. Islam had the advantage of emerging when Christianity and Judaism already dominated the landscape. It could borrow narratives, adapt terminology, position itself as a corrective fulfillment. A new religion today faces skepticism precisely because we've seen this movie before. We know how prophets emerge. We know how texts develop. We know how movements gain traction. Islam succeeded, undeniably. 600 million Muslims within 150 years. Conquest across 3 continents, enduring civilization. But success doesn't prove divine origin. Alexander the Great conquered the known world. Did heaven appoint him? Did the Mongols build the largest land empire in the history? Were they instruments of God? History is littered with successful movements that weren't divinely commissioned. So we come down to the credibility question. Let me now address the core argument directly, and I want to be fair to both sides. Christian apologetics position. Christianity traces roots to Jewish tradition, stretching back 3 millennia. The Old Testament was composed, transmitted, and preserved across centuries. The New Testament claims were proclaimed within decades of the events. Physical evidence appeared quickly. Eyewitness testimony existed, and transformation of followers was documented. Now let's look at the Islamic position. Islam claims to complete Abrahamic tradition, not to replace it, but Muhammad is the seal of the prophets, the final correction after earlier revelations were corrupted. The Qur'an's preservation is miraculous, unchanged since revelation. Rapid spread demonstrates divine backing. Here's the critical perspective. The chronological gap is real. Judaism precedes Christianity by roughly 1,500 to 2,000 years. Christianity precedes Islam by 600 years. Each layer adds distance from the original source. Shared narratives raise questions about influence versus revelations. If the Quran tells stories from Genesis and the Gospels, was this divine continuity or human borrowing? Manuscript evidence exists for all 3 traditions, but manuscripts prove existence of text, not divine authorship. The real test isn't manuscripts. It's claims that exceed historical verification. For Christianity, resurrection, miracles, divine sonship. For Islam, angelic delivery, imitatable text, and scientific foreknowledge. Neither claim can be empirically tested. Both require faith. The bottom line, if you demand historical proximity, Christianity wins. 600-year gap favors the earlier revelation. If you accept prophetic authority regardless of timing, Islam's claims stand on their own merits. If you reject supernatural claims entirely, both faiths collapse. There's no middle ground where one demands empirical proof and the other accepts faith claims. Either revelation is possible. So you have to take some time and really look back and find what is faith, what is truth, and what might be fiction. And that's part of the reflection you need to do. So I want to close this podcast today with honesty. I'm not here to convince you Islam is false. I'm not here to prove Christianity is true. Those battles belong in your heart, not my microphone. What I offer is this. Examine the evidence yourself. Read the text, study the timelines, look at what manuscripts actually tell us and what they don't. And then ask yourself, what would count as proof for either claim? Why do I trust one testimony over the other? Does historical proximity matter to me? Can I believe something I cannot verify? For Christians, the invitation is simple. Trust the witnesses who came before. Their testimony reached you across 19 centuries. For Muslims, the invitation differs. Trust the preservation of the Qur'an, the miracle of its text, and the life of Muhammad as exemplar. For skeptics, the challenge stands. What grounds do we have for believing any religious revelation occurred? Faith isn't blind, but it does require steps beyond pure evidence. Every believer takes that step. The question is, which foundation supports it best? Islam's origins lie firmly in the 7th century. No scholar disputes this. Manuscripts from that era exist. Shared heritage with Judaism and Christianity is acknowledged. Christianity's origins lie in the 1st century, rooted in traditions stretching back a millennia. Manuscripts from that era survive eyewitness claims documented early. Which timeline gives you more confidence? That's for you to decide. Thank you for listening to Voices of Life, a ministry of the Church for Life. Till next time, seek truth with courage, question with humility, and may wisdom guide your journey. I'm Pastor David.
Thank you for joining this Voices of Life special. History matters. Evidence matters. And when we examine the origins of the Qur'an and the rise of Islam, we discover a story shaped not by ancient biblical revelation, but by the religious debates of the 7th century. Christianity stands on the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, a foundation rooted in history, witnesses, and scripture. May this exploration strengthen your faith, deepen your understanding, and remind you that truth can stand the test of time. Until next time, may God's peace be upon you.